Welcome to the Hispanic Serving Institution STEM Hub Summer Webinar Series. We would like to take a few minutes to welcome you and to introduce ourselves. I am Martha Desmond.
I am Delia Valles. We are both STEM faculty at New Mexico State University and on the STEM Hub leadership team. We hope you find this webinar series helpful in your pursuit of NSF funding.
Thank you. I am Martha Desmond with New Mexico State University and the NSF Hispanic Serving Institution STEM Hub. I'd like to welcome you all to our third webinar of our weekly summer webinar series targeting the NSF HSI call that is due in September. Some of our webinars from our weekly series are general in nature, whereas others are very topic specific. Today's topic is framing student success. We have over 300 participants registered for this webinar today from across the country. So welcome to everyone. And I encourage you, if you have not yet joined our portal, please do so today. And the web link was on the screen earlier, or you can go ahead and Google it and join. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. Each webinar is 1 hour in length, and we anticipate each of the panelists will speak for 20 minutes. And this will leave 20 minutes for questions at the end. There is never enough time for questions. And so I want to remind everyone that we have 2 webinars this summer that are devoted entirely to question and answers. The first one is on the 16th of June. We're also going to be posting the transcripts of each of these webinars with or the transcripts of all questions on our portal. We've had a little trouble with our transcription service, but we think we have it resolved, so everything should be in place in the next couple of days. And then we'll also be able to address all questions that we didn't get to today. And we'll also have transcripts from the past webinars posted as well. At the end of today's presentation, you're going to receive a short monkey survey by email, and would greatly appreciate it if you would go ahead and fill that out. I also want to say that we're starting a new initiative, and that is to take questions in advance of the webinar. And you're going to receive, for future webinars, you'll receive a monkey survey, and it will allow you to submit questions to the speakers ahead of time. We just ask that all questions that are submitted are done 48 hours in advance so that the panelists have time to think about them while they're organizing their presentation. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce both of our speakers, Dr. Virginia White and Dr. Alex Rosales. Virginia White attended Wake Forest University, where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Mathematics before attending University of California, Riverside, where she earned her PhD in Botany. After graduating, she began teaching at Riverside City College, where she is today, first as an adjunct and then as a tenure-track faculty. Virginia is a PI on Riverside City College's NSF grant, STEM in Familia, where the focus is to create an academic family for students, most of whom are Latinx. Alex Rosales is an associate professor in the School of Earth, Environment, and Marine Sciences at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He directs the NSF I-Use program, transforming undergraduate education in STEM through culturally relevant pedagogy and community engagement, where his team offers professional development to faculty across the College of Sciences, offering tools, ideas, and shared experiences so that they may transform their own teaching, research, and service in ways that improve their students' success. We'll start this afternoon with Virginia and then move to Alex. And what I am going to do is, before 5 minutes, I'll hold this up so everyone can see that there's 5 minutes left, and we can start to wind one panelist down and start the next panelist, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions at the end. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm Virginia White, and I'm the PI on our STEM and Familia project. So I structured my presentation to you to talk a little bit about how we came to design our project as a way of thinking about framing student success. And as a botanist who is now suddenly teaching everything online, I have taken a million pictures of plants. And so I didn't really have good pictures to jazz up my slides. So I chose a bunch of pictures of my plants that I've been putting into my lectures and labs for you, just to add a little color. So for our team, it was very important to come up with a strategy for how to go about designing a project and envisioning a project. One of the things that we're all used to in science is thinking about our research projects, but not necessarily thinking of the educational interaction with our students in that same sort of mindset. So this was a structure that we worked through to help us to complete the vision of our project as a more research-oriented project. So I'm going to go through each of the steps here that I've listed for you and sort of talk about what I mean by those things. So the first is to assemble your team, and it depends upon what kind of a project you're envisioning, whether you are assembling your team for a particular department or maybe a whole division or a group of departments, that sort of thing. Our project is STEM broad, so it includes chemistry and physics and math, psychology and biology, but maybe you're looking at a project that is targeting a particular group of students, maybe remedial math classes and how to supplement your students or support your students now that we're in California, so now that remedial math courses are not available anymore. But one thing I want to make sure that I stress is that we try to take an opportunity here to see this as an opportunity to mentor new faculty. So don't always just go to the same people. Bring in some new ideas, bring in some new minds, bring in some young faculty who have experience in other places, who are enthusiastic and energetic, because this is a great opportunity to mentor them in the process of grantsmanship. And then remember all of those other services that might need to be part of your team. So depending on what your particular project is going to be, this might include vice presidents, it might include deans, it should include institutional research no matter what, admissions and records, library, etc. And try to think about who you might be missing, because it's always that missing entity that shows up at the right time and provides that gem of information that you really needed. We feel like it's really important for us to invite a dialogue, to open up the dialogue to anyone. So we try to have the conversation around a particular topic. So when we came together for our project, we wanted to ask the question, where are students in STEM not being very successful? And we let everybody put whatever their thoughts were on the table. That's often going to take you in squirrely directions, but what it does is it gives you a feeling for what the general feel is from different entities. Where are the commonalities? Sometimes the list is very long, and that's okay. You'll find some patterns in there potentially that you can then go chase down. But when you don't let the ideas come to the surface, then sometimes people are going to say, well, we knew that wasn't going to work, or we knew this wasn't a problem. If you give the opportunity for everybody to put their ideas on the table, not that you're going to chase down all of those ideas, but then it validates the concerns that people have, and maybe there's some ideas that come out of that that don't require grant funding to address. Okay. At this point, you may realize that you just have more questions than you have answers. And that's often the case. We often realize that at the end of this, we don't know enough to know what we do know, to know what we need to know. Then once you've got your list of potential topics, it's time to start organizing, and that's where you're looking for patterns in those data. So when we sat down with faculty, we sat down with various administrators, student services, library, counseling, various entities on our campus, and said, where are our STEM students struggling? And we put a ton of ideas on the table. And then we whittled it back to way too many, but a shorter list nonetheless. So maybe you realize that you have a resource access problem, be it physical, the library isn't open long enough, or you don't have a study space. maybe it's financial. The books are too expensive. We don't have resources to supplement computer facilities or something like that. Maybe you discover that it's an engagement issue, which is one of the things that our campus realized. Our students were on campus, but maybe not as engaged as we wanted them to be in the campus life. And maybe you have a gateway course that has a high DFW rate, right? Whatever your particular outcome is, you want to make sure that aligns with your strategic planning goals, because there's nothing that happens if it doesn't line up nicely with strategic planning goals. These are all student success projects, so presumably that's a part of your strategic planning process. So they should, but thinking about how to incorporate it, the kinds of timelines that your strategic planning process works through, keeping those things in mind. Some of the themes that you will find are going to be more urgent than others. So some things can wait a little longer, some things are a little bit more urgent and must be addressed sooner. So maybe there's a few things on that list that can be addressed in other ways other than the project, because we know the funding is going to take a little while to come in. And this is usually the point at which we are able to whittle down to the core team, the team who's really going to design and implement the project. And so some of the entities that you had present at the table in the beginning may no longer be important. So maybe counseling isn't going to be part of the project anymore because it's really going to focus on library access. And now library is going to take over the main role. So you can sort of tailor that team. Then we get into gathering the data. There's going to be a little bit of back and forth between determining your focus and gathering your data. So sometimes once you pick a focus, you gather some data about it, then you have to go back and adjust your focus. That's a bit of a push-pull situation. So maybe, if you have an access issue, you need to know when is it that they access the resources? How do they access those resources? Where do they access those resources? And so that you can start to design the project. If you can't answer those questions, then you may have to come up with strategies to do that. So this is where sometimes the data takes you back to adjusting your focus again. If it's a motivation issue, who participates in campus activities? How do they get motivated, right? What kinds of outreach can you do that you already do? What kinds of outreach can you do to target this other population? We had done a lot of studies on our campus, a lot of surveys, asking students about their engagement in campus activities, and we had information about our Latinx students that suggested that they did not feel very engaged in the campus culture. And so we knew that that was an area that we were going to want to focus on because we knew that they felt disconnected. If we didn't have those data, we would have had to go out and do the survey in order to be able to justify that. So depending upon what kind of data you have available, that might adjust your focus a bit. So if it's a high DFW rate course, right, maybe you're asking questions about or getting data about which populations do succeed. What's different about that population than the population that isn't succeeding? Can you find or identify a pattern from a prerequisite course? We have been asking a lot of questions about our engineering students, for example, and discovered that we don't know how to identify them. I'm at a community college, and so we have this unusual situation where we have a major called math and science, which does not give us a lot of detail. They can major in actual areas, or they can major in this sort of broad math and science, but that's any STEM student. That could be a biology major, a chemistry major, it doesn't matter. And so it's hard for us to track our engineering students, for example. So we have to go find a proxy to be able to identify what our engineering students are doing. And for us, the proxy is going to be a particular physics course that is tailored for the engineering students. But have we lost students before we get there? How can we track the students who are likely to get to that class, and which classes did they take before that? So sometimes there's a little backwards tracing, and then you can find the right set of criteria to identify what the student need is and whether you are making a difference in that group, that population. So one of the things that we discovered, for example, is that their likelihood of passing subsequent calculus classes is determined by their likelihood or their success in their first calculus class. If they get an A in the first calculus class, they are much more likely to pass the subsequent ones and then get into that engineering class. The kids who got a C in that first calculus class are less likely to make it to the others. So that's the population that we might be losing. And so that's the population to target. If they get a C in the first class, they're less likely to pass the second class. We can go in and support them in that second class to help them get through there and maybe help them get into that physics class ultimately, as an example. So we couldn't get those data very easily. We had to sort of do this backwards tracing to get there. Sometimes you have to do that depending upon what data is available. Look at the educational literature. Of course, you want to know what the best practices are and the big thoughts in the area within which you are trying to create supports. And then again, incorporating institutional research in those conversations is really, really meaningful. So when we have these conversations, we sit around the table and institutional research knows what kinds of data they can pull easily, which things they cannot pull easily. So what might seem like a very easy piece of information to me to gather is not necessarily something that they can just really quickly run a report for me. It's not always possible to have institutional research in the meetings, in each meeting, but where you can, having that regular conversation with them about the kinds of topics that you're talking about keeps them up to date, because it does take a little while to get some of those results back and you're going to need them. Then it's time to sort of begin to develop your plan. What needs to happen to change that status quo? So maybe you're expanding hours, maybe you're adding tutors, etc. If you have to know what your success problem is to know whether you have changed it. So you need your starting point to know whether you have made a difference. So again, those data are really, really important. At this point, as you're developing your plan, you may have to reach out to additional administrators. So as we developed our plan for our project, we realized we wanted to incorporate psychology as a part of our project. And that is housed in our humanities division. So we had to incorporate the humanities dean into our conversation because that academic area would now be represented. So sometimes you're going to need to pull in more people. She brought in a lot of expertise and information from her division that was very informative and useful as we were designing our plan. So you are going to need that buy-in in order to get that project started. So getting that administrator, whatever administrators are necessary on board as early as possible is really, really important. And if there's any other entities, so if it's going to involve campus outreach, we brought campus outreach in because we were trying to motivate students right out of high school coming in. So at that point, as we were designing our project, we brought in the outreach office. We brought in the transfer office because we're trying to get them transferred on to the next institution. So they weren't there from the very beginning, but we pulled them in so that they could help us to design the plan. Again, identifying those particular metrics. To increase something, you're going to have to know what your current level is. So we needed to know what our current transfer rates were in STEM in order to be able to prove that we are increasing them. Try to be ambitious about what you're going to do, but you have to be realistic. You can say you're going to increase transfers by 50%, but that's going to be pretty hard to enact. So you want to think about what's a realistic percentage or number that we can increase. If you have a lot of students like we do, we have 5,000 students who have declared a major in STEM. Even a small percent increase is a huge number more students who are transferring on. So we're not going to be able to impact absolutely all of those 5,000 students with this project, but trying to increase that percentage by some, number is really, really helpful. So think about your short-term and your long-term metrics. The short-term metrics are sometimes more straightforward. So you're looking at percent who is successfully completing a course, the number that attends tutoring, the mean GPA after intervention, whatever. We have designed particular courses that we call home courses. So it's calculus and chemistry that they would take otherwise, but we're trying to create like a family feel to it, do some cohort building with those students. And so we need to know what was the completion rate before the intervention. So in a the historical completion rate of those courses. And then we can look at completion rate after we have implemented our interventions in those courses. We also do some workshops. So we look at the number that attend the workshops and then look at whether those students are more successful in those courses that they were enrolled in. So those are our short-term metrics. Longer-term metrics can be trickier. So that's often something like the percent graduating or the percent declaring a major, retention within a STEM major, something like that. Those can be trickier because those are longer timeline. For us at a community college, we can sometimes do transfer rates, but graduation rates are often too far off in the distance. Because as you all know, many people will take 5 or 6 years to complete college. So we won't get those data back in time. We were targeting freshmen initially in our project. And so we realized that we were going to have a problem trying to get those longer term metrics because they were freshmen. And for them to get all the way through to transfer is on average 4 years, 3 to 4 years at our institution, and that's the duration of our project. So we have some proxies that we can use. The completion of the subsequent course, that is an indicator that they're staying in the field, that they're staying in the major. We can look at whether they've changed their major as a proxy to whether we are retaining them in STEM. So it doesn't give us necessarily that graduation rate or that transfer rate, but we can use that as a guide of whether we are being successful. In terms of identifying your timelines for plan implementation, there's never going to be enough planning time, but try to build in some actual planning time for yourselves. And then think about those institutional timelines. So we all know that certain data become available at particular times of the year, often not at the time that you need it or just at the wrong time. So our reports are due to NSF before I get success in a course. I can't get those data until later. And so we have to be a little bit creative. We reach out to the faculty and try to get some of those success rates. We try to get information from the faculty who are teaching those classes just as a gauge, and then work from there. But also you have institutional timelines for when things are happening, big things are happening, strategic planning activities. Don't be asking your IR department for tons and tons of data when they are trying to generate tons of data for other things. You won't get it. We have outreach to other institutions. We are trying to increase transfer. So we are trying to get students onto 4-year campuses. And so we have 4-year universities as our partners. So we had to pull those in. That's going to require administrative conversation. And so you have to plan in a little bit of time for those conversations to happen. Again, be ambitious with these, the timeline and the plan implementation, but also try to be realistic. And as just a personal note, we always plan way too many things. So if you can have that self-control to pull something out, you can always end up doing more than you need to, but we always end up planning way more than is reasonable to actually get done. So try to be cautious of overdoing the ideas. And then just remember that you will adjust the plan. I think this spring is the perfect example of that. We are struggling to create community like everybody else is in a virtual environment. So this is a new challenge that we hadn't anticipated, and we had to kind of throw out some of what we were doing before and re-envision what we're going to be doing as we move forward. So there are places where our plan is rigid and can't be changed, and there's other places where it's very flexible, and we're looking to those flexible places to reimagine. But we also think this is a great opportunity to really engage students in a new way. And so we're pretty excited about the opportunity to try to design really good interventions for our students to keep them in STEM. And this is a real challenge right now where it's very easy for them to fall through the cracks. So we are looking very deeply at our support structures. And this is where we are now starting to pull back in those other entities that were part of our conversation originally, so that they can help us to gauge what kind of success we're making, where we are in such an unusual time with so many unknowns about how education is working. Remember that if you make an adjustment, it's not failure. You have learned, you've made an adjustment as a result of information and data. And then surround yourself with smart, creative people, and you will be very successful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Virginia, and right on time. Okay, Alex. And remember, as Alex is coming on board here, please post your questions under the question and answer section. The chat can be on the chat section, but if all the questions are under question and answer, it's just easier for us to collate them at the end. Okay. Alex, we don't see you yet.
Yep. Okay, hold on. I'm sorry here. Just trying to find out how I open my start video. Okay, sorry. Share a screen. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see my presentation here, Dr. Desmond?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, good morning to some of you guys. I think we're joining in other time zones. As Dr. Desmond mentioned, my name is Alex Rosales. I am a professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, which is in the deep South Texas. We are actually one of the colleges that are under 25 degrees latitude. So there are a few of us out there. And so we actually are in a part of Texas that's bordering the US-Mexico border. A few years ago, my colleagues and I put together a proposal to the National Science Foundation to transform undergraduate education in STEM at our college through cultural relevance and community engagement. And this was a proposal that we put together in part with a couple of education specialists, one on pedagogy and one on assessment, and some staff at our Office for Community Engagement. And we are in our second year, and part of this presentation is to share with you guys our advances as we've had the last two years. We're almost at 2 full years now. But then also just to take a real course view about what student success means at our institution as a proxy for the discussion at Hispanic serving institutions across the country. In communication with Dr. Desmond, I set these objectives based on what I thought would be a good guiding principle for our discussion here. Really what I wanted to do was to use this opportunity to begin a discourse on the role of Hispanic serving institutions on student success, explore some very generic ways that we've used at our institution to include these elements in, maybe that you might include some of the elements that we have tried and learned from in your future proposals on STEM education. And then really just to kind of get to know this community. I know that I've been kind of a silent observer from the outside, and I'm very honored and excited to be actively participating. So as I mentioned, I'm going to take a more course view. I know Dr. White had some very good suggestions to offer you guys based on her experience. And I'd like to just step back a little bit and have a more generic discussion on how does teaching at a Hispanic serving institution actually inform our metrics for student success. And I think in part of that, it's really good to start with understanding what a Hispanic serving institution is, right? And I could go farther back, but we can start in the 80s when there was a discussion, a broad discussion amongst several institutions across Illinois, across Texas, New York, California, New Mexico, who are seeing the opportunities gained by historically Black colleges and universities from the provisions under the 1965 Higher Education Act. In seeing those opportunities where they had some monies set aside for our HBCUs, this actually inspired the notion of what was being called as a Hispanic institution, kind of the equivalent of a historically Black college. And in the mid 80s, in fact, in 1986, leaders from New Mexico and Texas actually created a new organization called the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, which we know as HACU. And that institution decided that universities and colleges with a Hispanic student population of 25% was a sufficient critical mass for this new designation. And so, working through the Hispanic Caucus in Congress, they pushed Congress to make new legislation. And in 1992, the term Hispanic Serving Institution became official and defined as an accredited and degree granting public and private institution, nonprofit institution of higher education with 25% or more total undergraduate Hispanic full-time equivalent student enrollment. That's actually word for word out of the legislation. So since 1992, we've had this designation, and it first started with just a handful of institutions from the states that I mentioned, and then in the last 20 some odd years, almost 40 years, there are now 539 HSIs across the country. Now, and most of these institutions actually become HSIs due to a shift in demography in their respective regions. And so I'd like to just point out the distinct difference here between what was other minority serving institutions like HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, in that HSIs became HSIs, whereas HBCUs were designed to directly serve the African American community. In fact, as I mentioned, their roots go back way earlier than the 1980s. In fact, from the 1860s, as you can imagine, there was a lot going on in the country where African Americans actually had to create their own colleges because they were restricted access to other institutions at the time. And so in this case, we have an inherent difference between HBCUs, even though we use their experience to inspire the creation of HSIs. And as you can see, institutions like the National Science Foundation, institutions like other granting institutions actually have reserved some money based on the 1992 legislation, and put some money aside specifically for HSIs. And recognizing the fact that a lot of these institutions are under-resourced and don't have the same access to federal funding as some of the larger institutions that we're familiar with. Part of the reason why I explain this to you is because I think for most of us who are on the call at the moment, you guys are at an HSI, and you may not understand the work and the history behind becoming an HSI. And so there is a benchmark that all HSIs have to reach. But the truth is, there was a lot of discussion, negotiation, lobbying around the 80s that allowed these institutions to receive that classification and to compete for the money that's set aside for Hispanic serving institutions. Now, most Hispanic serving institutions, well, at least many of them, are plagued with the same statistics, right? A lot of us have low graduation rates and poor student retention. And so this contributes to a deficit narrative in which minority students come from certain demographic backgrounds, like our low income, and they are commonly portrayed as either high risk, high maintenance, or underprepared. And this is very common. You see it not just documented in literature, but you see it in the very dialogue of administrators and professors at these institutions. And that narrative, I think, in many ways signals a need to switch to a more asset-based model for student success, which is geared towards the very audience that they're meant to serve, right? Latino and Latina students. And this new model should focus on an equitable education that acknowledges and nurtures a student's cultural and linguistic wealth. So in this way, these Hispanic serving institutions, they have a tremendous opportunity to be more intentional. And in fact, they can be Latino or Latina enhancing institutions that serve students by providing curricula that are culturally relevant, that are inclusive and transformative, or better yet, curricula that focus on the students' lived experience, their knowledge, and their cultural wealth. And by doing so, educational research in particular, see that these types of curricular innovations result in students that not only see themselves in that institutional practice, they see themselves as part of the institution, either be it at the university, they see themselves as part of science or STEM, but they also develop a deeper sense of self along the way. And this is something that I think most of us might be familiar with. You know, I mean, there are students that continue to suffer from imposter syndrome, or they have a general sense that they don't belong either in a work environment or at a specific institution. And this also points to the fact that that there's an opportunity to change that. And that vision is congruent with some of the current findings on the assets that promote Latino and Latina academic success in college. And so the work by Laura Rendon and BJ Kangala out of Texas, they did a report saying that things like giving back, social justice consciousness, family, responsibility, and something that's called ganas, which is just like this deep motivation to succeed, are things that are actually fuel academic success. And so ways that we can teach or ways that we can interact with students that promote that recognize those strengths, and that de-emphasize the focus on a deficit, I think is a good starting point for the new direction of Hispanic serving institutions. In our institution at UTRGV, I think we're very similar in many ways. We actually have a 90% Hispanic student population, which is representative of our local area where we are. Almost 40% of those students are actually part-time students, meaning to say that they work, they have families, they are coming to college. I had a student once who only came to college every spring, because in the fall he was out picking vegetables or fruits. And in Michigan in particular, he would go up every year and help with some harvests, I think of cherries. He graduated in 8 years, which of course, according to most statistics, say that he exceeded the normal graduation period, but he actually only attended for 8 semesters. So this is something that I think we have to pay attention to. And at UTRGV, they're starting to do that. They recognize that they need to develop these ethics of care, ethics of community, ethic of inquiry, and an ethic of agency in the way that they interact with students. So, we see this. There was a recent book published. I can't remember the author's name at the moment. One of them is one of my colleagues, who have published recent findings on how to sufficiently educate teachers at Hispanic institutions. And these are the 5 things that they focus on, that teachers need to focus on student identity and background. They need to embrace the students' families as a partner in teaching and learning. They need to draw on cultural and social values. They need to recognize diverse ways of knowing. And they also need to promote the challenge of oppression, marginalization, and disenfranchisement that happen at these institutions. I'm going to skip ahead because I think that these are things that we need to focus on. And I think a good proposal for STEM education need to actually focus on these outcomes. And this is, based on the work that we're doing. They should focus on academic success with a focus on developing the students' intrinsic motivation for learning. That is a key metric of success. We also have to develop cultural competence, not just in our students, but in our faculty. And they understand that they should support and nurture their cultural competence by maintaining cultural integrity, demonstrating pride and self in cultural heritage. Things that as Laura Rendon noted, these are important considerations in the students' persistence in college. And then finally, this idea of social political consciousness. And this draws on early work that concludes that critical consciousness actually helps students become aware of their role in a lot of the injustices, inequities, and the dominant ideologies that they have experienced themselves in classrooms. So how can we as faculty, I think we're all STEM faculty, how can we promote these outcomes? And these are some of the images that you see of faculty development workshops that we offer here at UTRGV, using a framework called the Community Learning Exchange. So we actually bring faculty out to meet various community partners, and here you see them meeting one of our Colonia groups that we work with, our Colonia partners, Proyecto Juan Diego. You can see the faculty on the inside, and then there are partners, students on the outside. They have a dialogue about effective learning and strategies. We use this, and we actually recognize the assets that they bring in terms of understanding students and understanding what community needs. We view them as experts, we listen to their stories, and then we focus on their assets and hope. And in many cases, these faculty include those in their own teaching. Let's see, let me scoot on ahead. You can see an image here of some of our faculty offering courses in those communities. We have another faculty down here, a biology professor who brought students out into community. We also have a statistics professor who brings students out into community to survey people at rallies and at protests to get their opinions and things like that. Now, we see this, when we develop our faculty using the Community Learning Exchange, we encourage them to follow these steps. We want them to share their teaching philosophy with their students. We want them to focus on student learning rather than on what the course actually covers, but really understand whether they're losing students, whether they're keeping their students' interests, and how to get the students actively engaged in their own teaching and their own learning. So we actually provide this feedback as part of our development workshop. It's a series of 5 days where faculty come in and they do exercises, they meet community partners. It actually, we launch it with a 3-day intensive faculty development workshop where they meet community partners. They all together as a cohort. They have time for writing and reflection. They understand where they live. They understand who their students are. You know, here you see we took them to the border wall to understand that there are a lot of students who live on both sides of the wall. And so, you know, one of the things that we want our faculty to do is to use these experiences to not only transform what they do in the classroom, but to be able to transform and help shepherd that dialogue across the institution. I think they've come to realize, based on our faculty surveys, that the traditional metrics of success that they use at predominantly white institutions or other institutions that are not minority serving may not really be applicable or relevant to institutions that are Hispanic serving institutions. You know, they've actually helped in future professional development. I always encourage faculty to enroll in professional development when it comes to culturally responsive teaching. If you're thinking about implementing this in a grant, then maybe you should include that as part of your faculty development, because really faculty are the drivers of this, right? When you have faculty who are practicing cultural relevant pedagogy or who understand what it means to engage with the community, they're the ones who are driving student success. In fact, from an administrative role, I know that faculty actually are our largest expense when it comes to administration of a university. So this is something to keep in mind. And then finally, it's those same very faculty that are on the tenure and promotion committees, on their department, on their college. So what we would like to see is to shepherd a gradual change in what the expectations are for faculty through changes and shifts in tenure and promotion guidelines, because as we know, some of these metrics rarely include the elements of cultural, community, student success that are important to the institutions in which we teach and work. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you again to Dr. Desmond for the opportunity to speak with y'all. Hopefully we can have a meaningful dialogue, and I encourage anybody who have any questions about this work to please reach out to me. You're welcome to reach out to me through the network or through Dr. Desmond, and that's it for now.